Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much.
I was just describing how brilliant his career was, how he started. He died at the age of 94, which makes him the longest living president in the history of United States. And he was a successful businessman. He was one of the youngest aviators during Second World War. And then he went to Yale University and he became a congressman and director of CIA, vice president for 8 years, and then president. So it's a brilliant career. How do you think he will be remembered?
Well, what you've outlined is that he was clearly, in terms of American history, one of the best prepared people to become president. He was a diplomat in China. He was head of the CIA. He served in Congress briefly. And of course, he served 8 years as Ronald Reagan's vice president, had numerous meetings during that time with allies overseas, and so had a very good preparation for when he ran himself in 1988 and won the presidency. And of course, we also know from history that he has quite a record of accomplishment in terms of foreign policy goals and achievements, not the least of which was the end of the Cold War, how we went from an adversary of the Soviet Union to working with the new state of Russia, the assimilation of the two Germanys. These were enormous challenges at the time, which we've glossed over, mainly because he helped to make them so smooth. And of course, the other memorable thing from his presidency in terms of foreign policy was the first Gulf War, the eradication of Iraq out of Kuwait, but more so the way he went about building a coalition of international partners, including some from the Middle East, to confront Iraq about that.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes, something that today would seem a lot more difficult for any president to try to undertake.
Right, yes. The first Gulf War that you just mentioned, that was when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and it was a little more than a month, within a little more than a month, Iraq was defeated and Kuwait was free again. So that was certainly one big thing in his CV.
And as we know from history, yes, not only did he quickly move Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, he chose not to do some long occupation of Iraq or go after and try to take out of power Saddam Hussein at that time. We also know that his son, when he became president, did launch an invasion of Iraq some years later, and that led to a very lengthy conflict and a difficult time for the U.S. in Iraq. But I think the country was quite impressed with the handling of the liberation of Kuwait and the fact that at that time the U.S. did not become entrenched in a longer-term conflict in Iraq. The country was so impressed, by the way, that in 1991, in the months after the Gulf War ended, President Bush's approval rating in the polls was up past 90%. That's probably the highest recorded figure for any president in terms of his approval rating. But of course, we also know the other part of that story is that less than a year later, yes, he was defeated in a bid for a second term. And part of this is the story of George H.W. Bush, how that success in foreign policy, he was not able always to translate that into success at the ballot box here at home, into public support when he needed it most.
That is the thing. I still remember clearly when in 1992 the presidential debate was going on between him and Ross Perot and Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton looked so young and handsome in contrast, and George H.W. Bush, as you mentioned, that he was probably the best prepared president. still, and also his success in so many fields, he lost that election. So what really happened? Why he lost?
He was caught between two sort of opposing forces at that time. In his own Republican Party, there was a growing split, with conservatives wanting less compromise with Democrats, wanting to hold the line, particularly on taxes and government spending. And the president at that time entered into an agreement with Democrats, working across bipartisan lines, to craft a budget agreement in 1990 that effectively broke his promise from 1988 not to raise taxes. That angered people in his own Republican Party on the far right. And he also was caught between the forces represented by Bill Clinton on the Democratic side. People did not feel as though President Bush was properly aware of the economic struggles of their own lives. And they took that out on him at the ballot box in November of 1992, and he was defeated. He was portrayed somewhat as out of touch on the economy and on the everyday struggles that Americans were going through. So all the great success from the Gulf War and shepherding the end of the Cold War were not enough to get him a second term as president, which is a rather significant fact, and it's a big part of his biography. That is why some who admire Bush will often refer to him as perhaps our greatest one-term president.
He's also described as a family person sometimes. He has 6 children, and he's lucky to be the father of another president, which is George Bush. And you interviewed him in the mid-80s.
Yes.
You yourself interviewed him. Can you remember what kind of a person he was?
Yes, very much so. I mean, then George H.W. Bush was vice president under Ronald Reagan. He had recently returned from a trip to North Africa, and I was then working in the Africa division here at VOA and was sent to interview him about his trip. And if you challenged him, he could get what we would say feisty. He could get a little kind of tough in his answers, but he was also a very genial man, very solicitous. He would ask about you, and I do remember after the interview where we had some little sparring exchanges, he presented me with a tie clip that I still have. So this was someone who, you know, was what we would call old school politics. He was very competitive. He could be very sort of partisan as a politician. But at the end of the day, he felt it was mainly a call to service that was the driving force in his life. And so he was more than happy to work with Democrats, with members of the opposing party, to get something done for the country. And that is, I think, in some ways where things have changed, say in the 30 or so years since he was in office, that there's less of that we see now among politicians for higher office. The politics in the United States has grown more tribal. And in that sense, President Bush was a throwback to an era where it wasn't just pure ambition that drove people politically, but a call to duty, a call to serve the country in a larger sense.
One of the things that he's remembered for also is 1,000 Points of Light, the award that he gave to so many volunteers in the early 90s. And actually, one of the recipients is the current chief of Bangla Service, Rokeya Haidar. She received that award like so many other volunteers who were recognized by late President. We have seen him as a politician and in later times as a father, as an aging man. How do you evaluate him as a human being?
One way is to look what happened to him right after he lost, which was a very personally devastating moment for him to be denied a second term after all his accomplishments. But we were shown his grace by the letter he left for his successor, Bill Clinton, left in the Oval Office on the desk as Clinton came in to take over. And basically, it was a very complimentary note and saying that he was rooting for the new president. This is the man who had defeated him. Not only that, in subsequent years, the two men formed a very close friendship. They worked together on various charities and fundraising drives for different causes around the world. So that also gives you a real insight into what drove President Bush, both as a president, as a leader, but also as a former president, someone seeking to do good for humanity. And the fact that he had such a close bond with Bill Clinton, the man who defeated him, that's not always the case in our politics. And it says a lot about how he valued political relationships and just helping people in general.
I mean, to me, it seems like he was a great patriot. He loved his country, and which is why in his teen years, he joined the Air Force.
He had some good fortune there because that particular mission, he was shot down. There were other naval aviators shot down around that same time, and if they had been taken captive by the Japanese, they were executed. He was fortunate. He was in the water for a few hours, and an American submarine was nearby and picked him up. Otherwise, his fate might have been vastly different. But think of all the duties he's taken on in his life. He was a warrior. He was a peacemaker. He was a diplomat, head of the Central Intelligence Agency, trying to further relations with China. Just a very wide background. He was an oil man in Texas, so he has a business sense as well. So he had but from early on, he was running for office in the early 1960s, even for the Senate, where maybe some people thought he was too young to do that. So he had a driving ambition, but the ambition wasn't always the glorification of himself. He was taught that by his parents, actually, not to make him his own personal goals, the main goal, but to serve the country and to serve the common good. And in the end, there's a lot to show for his career and even his post-presidential life as a contributor to American society.
His funeral was held in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and 4 former presidents and the sitting president, Donald Trump, President Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and his son, George Bush, they all attended the funeral. And some of them spoke at the funeral, gave speeches, and so many other people remembered him with fond memories. Is there anything out of that funeral that struck you?
He does represent somewhat of an era in our politics and in our national history. He's probably the last World War II veteran among the presidents. That was a very big qualification for many years running for office here. So we have moved to the post-war generation now. And again, the generation of Bush always seeking compromise. Now it's much harder for politicians to compromise because they will pay a price within their own parties. We are so tribal in our differences that to actually reach out carries political risk. For many, many years here, that was not the case. It was the expectation of the public that you would reach out to compromise. He got burned a bit when he compromised with Democrats. It contributed to his election loss, and a lot of people noticed that. And ever since then, we see less compromise in our national officials, especially between the two parties. But I think Bush has an enduring legacy of service to the greater good, of keeping the country's broader interests in mind. And that always seemed to be what drove him, notwithstanding the fact, though, as a candidate in 1988, he ran a very tough campaign against Democrat Michael Dukakis, and many people criticized it, particularly for focusing on one particular aspect of prison furloughs, which they thought contained a racial ad. So he was criticized for that. He was seen as very competitive and very kind of cutthroat as a campaigner, but once he got into office, he was much more about finding common ground and I think doing some good things even on the domestic front. People with disabilities were helped, the environment was improved. So there were areas there where he sort of departed from his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, in a less conservative way.
Jim, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
দর্শক, এতক্ষণ আমরা কথা বলছিলাম যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের ৪১তম প্রেসিডেন্ট প্রয়াত জর্জ H.W. বুশ তাঁর স্মৃতিচারণ করছিলাম আমরা। তিনি একজন দেশপ্রেমিক ছিলেন, তিনি একজন সফল রাজনীতিবিদ ছিলেন, একজন সফল মানুষ ছিলেন। ৯৪ বছর বয়সে তিনি পরলোক গমন করলেন। আশা করি আজকের এই সাক্ষাৎকারটি আপনারা উপভোগ করেছেন। সবাই ভালো থাকুন, নিরাপদে থাকুন। আহসানুল হক, ভয়েস অব আমেরিকা।